The stone hall smelled of ash and pine smoke, and the sound bouncing off its walls was laughter. Not the warm kind, the cruel kind. 50 hatchlings stood in 2 lines on the cold floor, waiting for their turn to breathe fire in front of the whole court. It was the oldest ritual in Skyhold, older than the mountains themselves. Every hatchling had to prove they carried real dragon fire inside them. Those who could not were sent down, away from the halls of nobles, to spend their lives hauling stone and carrying water for dragons who were born stronger. Naira stood near the end of the line. She was smaller than her brothers and sisters, with scales the color of wet ash instead of the bright red and gold worn by the rest of her clutch. She had heard the whispers about her since the day she cracked out of her shell. The runt, the gray one, the one who would never fly high. When her name was called, she stepped forward on legs that felt too thin to hold her. She opened her jaws the way her mother had shown her 100 times, and she pushed everything she had toward her throat. What came out was not fire. It was a thin curl of gray smoke that drifted up and vanished before it even reached the ceiling. The hall exploded into laughter. Prince Rex, seated beside his mother on a ledge of black stone, laughed loudest of all. Queen Vera did not laugh, but she did not stop it either. She simply nodded to the court scribe, who wrote a single word beside Naira's name. Servant. It was done. From that moment, Naira would not be raised as a noble hatchling. She would carry water, clean stone, and serve those who could do what she could not. She was led out of the hall by an older servant dragon named Finn, who did not look at her with pity, only with the tired eyes of someone who had walked this same path many years before. Naira did not cry. She had cried enough already, in private, where no one could see. Instead, she walked with her head low and her wings pressed tight against her sides, trying to become as small and unseen as possible. That night, while the nobles feasted above in the high halls, a streak of fire crossed the sky far to the west. It was not dragon fire. It moved too fast, too straight, and it did not curve the way a flying dragon would curve. It struck the cliffs beyond the river with a sound like thunder, and a column of black smoke rose into the night. Word spread fast through the servant quarters. Something had fallen from the sky. General Drask ordered his wing guard to prepare for first light, certain it was some kind of weapon sent by the Frostfawn clan from the north. But Naira, lying awake on her cold stone shelf, could not stop thinking about the fire in the sky. She had nothing left to lose. She was already the useless hatchling. So before the sun rose, she slipped out of the servant quarters and flew low and quiet toward the western cliffs, long before the wing guard even woke. The crash site was worse than she expected. Trees were flattened in a wide circle, and smoke still rose from a strange metal shape half buried in the dirt. It did not look like anything she had ever seen. It was not stone, not wood, and not bone. It gleamed dull silver even under the dust and ash. She crept closer, her small body low to the ground, ready to run at the first sign of danger. That was when she heard it. A groan, a living sound, coming from inside the wreck. She found a gap in the twisted metal and pushed her head through, and there, pinned beneath a fallen support beam, was a creature unlike anything in any story she had ever been told. It stood on 2 legs like a person, but it had no scales, no wings, no tail. Its skin was pale and soft-looking, covered in strange cloth, and blood ran from a cut above its eye. The creature looked at her, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Naira expected it to scream, or attack, or run. Instead, it simply stared back at her with wide, exhausted eyes, and said something in a language she did not understand. His voice was rough, like he had swallowed smoke. Naira should have flown straight back to the wing guard. Reporting a strange creature from the sky was exactly the kind of thing that could earn her some small respect, maybe even a place back among the nobles. But something about the way it looked at her, not with hatred, not with mockery, just with quiet fear and pain, made her stay. She dug her small claws into the beam and pulled with all the strength her weak body had. It did not move much, but it was enough. The creature pushed with one arm, gritting its teeth, and together they freed it from the wreck. It collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard, one hand pressed against its side. Naira did not know what this creature was. She did not know its name, or where it came from, or why it had fallen from the sky. But as she sat beside it in the ruined trees, with the sun starting to rise behind the mountains, she understood one thing clearly. Whatever happened next, her life was never going back to what it had been before. Water dripped somewhere deep in the dark, a slow and steady sound that Daniel Cole had come to notice more than he expected, lying still with his ribs aching every time he breathed. 6 days had passed since the crash, and he still did not fully understand where he was. Only that a small, gray creature with wings had saved his life and hidden him in a cave far below a mountain city he had not yet seen with his own eyes. He did not know her name yet. Their first days together had been built from pointing, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick, and repeating sounds until they slowly began to make sense to each other. She brought him water in a cracked stone bowl and small pieces of dried meat she must have taken from her own share of food. She never asked for anything back, though he could tell from the way she moved, quiet and careful, always checking behind her, that she was risking something serious by keeping him hidden. On the 7th day, she finally pointed to herself and said a word slowly, twice. Naira. He repeated it back as best he could, and something in her expression changed, just slightly, like she was not used to anyone saying her name without a sneer attached to it. He pointed to himself and said his own name, and she tried it several times before she got it close enough that he understood. As the days went on, Daniel began to piece together fragments of her world from what she showed him. She drew a large hall on the cave floor, then drew herself standing small among many other shapes, then scratched out her own drawing hard enough to tear the dirt. He understood enough to know that wherever she came from, she was not respected there. He also began to notice things about her that did not match the picture she seemed to have of herself. When she tried to breathe even a small flame to warm the cave at night, it came out thin and uneven, but it was controlled. It did not scatter wildly the way he imagined an untrained creature's fire might. It moved almost exactly where she aimed it. Daniel had spent years as an engineer before the war took his ship and scattered his crew across 6 unknown systems. He knew the difference between raw power and precision, because in his old work, precision mattered more than size almost every time. He began to test small things with her, using sticks and stones instead of words. He built simple structures, showed her how a small amount of force placed exactly right could move something far heavier than it should. She watched closely, her eyes following his hands rather than his face, and within a few tries, she was arranging her own stones the same way, sometimes finding solutions he had not thought of first. It was during one of these quiet lessons that they heard voices above the cave entrance, deep and heavy, moving closer. Naira froze completely, every muscle locked, and pressed one wing protectively in front of Daniel without seeming to think about it. He understood the message even without words. Stay silent. Stay still. The voices belonged to a patrol searching the lower caves on the order of someone called Drask, a name Naira had mentioned before with clear unease. Daniel pressed himself into the shadow of a rock, and for several long minutes, the only sound in the cave was that same steady drip of water, now louder than ever in his ears. The voices eventually moved on, fading into the tunnels above, and Naira let out a breath she had clearly been holding. That night, she brought him something new, a length of cloth pulled from somewhere in the upper halls, worn and rough but warm. She laid it near him without a word, then curled up a short distance away, close enough to hear him, but not so close as to touch. Daniel realized, watching her in the dim light of her own small flame, that this creature had nothing to gain from any of this. She had already been cast down by her own people before he ever fell from the sky. Helping him only added more risk to a life that already held very little safety. He thought about his own crew, scattered and possibly dead, and about the long silence of space before his pod had struck this world. He did not know if he would ever get home. But he understood, lying in that cave with a creature the size of a large dog and the caution of someone who had learned young not to trust kindness, that he was not going to waste whatever chance he had been given. The next lesson he taught her was not about stones or structures. He drew a simple picture in the dirt, a shape like a shield, then broke it apart and rebuilt it from smaller pieces working together. He tapped the picture, then tapped her chest, then tapped his own. Naira stared at the drawing for a long moment, then looked up at him with something new in her expression, something that had not been there in the stone hall where she had failed her trial. It was the beginning of an idea neither of them could name yet, but both of them could feel taking shape in the dark of that cave, far below a kingdom that had already decided exactly what she was worth. General Drask noticed the tracks before anyone else did. Small clawed prints leading in and out of a cave entrance that should have been empty for years. He had commanded Skyhold's wing guard for longer than most of the young nobles had been alive, and he had not survived that long by ignoring small details. He followed the tracks himself, alone, torch in hand, and what he found at the end of the tunnel made him stop cold. A strange pale creature sat pressed against the wall, and beside it stood the gray hatchling everyone in the upper halls had already forgotten. Drask did not attack. He had faced enough real threats in his life to recognize when something in front of him was not one, whatever it looked like. Instead, he called for backup and had both of them brought before Queen Vera, more out of caution than cruelty. The court hall was just as cold and just as crowded as it had been on the day of Nyra's failed trial. But this time, every eye in the room was fixed on the strange creature standing beside her, wrapped in a torn cloth and clearly injured. Whispers filled the hall. Some nobles called it a Frostfang weapon. Others called it a demon from the old stories. Prince Rex simply laughed, the same way he had laughed weeks earlier, and said it was no surprise the useless hatchling had dragged in something just as useless as herself. Queen Vera raised one clawed hand, and the hall went silent immediately. She looked at Daniel for a long moment, then at Nyra, who stood in front of him despite her small size, refusing to step aside even under the weight of the queen's gaze. "Speak," Vera said, her voice low and even. "Tell me why I should not have this creature destroyed where it stands." Nyra's voice shook at first, but she did not stop. She explained, in halting words mixed with gestures, that the creature had done nothing but survive, that it had shown her more patience and honesty in a handful of days than she had received in her entire life among her own kind. She said it had ideas that could help Skyhold, though she could not yet prove it. Vera studied her for a long time before speaking again. She was not a queen who ruled through blind cruelty, whatever her son believed. She had built Skyhold's strength on results, not stories, and she decided, in that moment, that results were exactly what she would demand. A border village near the eastern hills had been suffering wyvern raids for months, fast and vicious creatures that struck at night and vanished before any patrol could catch them. 3 separate wingguard units had failed to stop them. Vera announced that Nyra and her strange creature would be given one chance to succeed where trained warriors had failed. If they returned with the raids ended, they would be heard. If they failed, or if the creature caused any harm, both would be dealt with as threats to the kingdom. Daniel understood enough of what was happening from Nyra's frantic explanation afterward to know exactly how much was riding on this. He asked her question after question about the wyverns, how they attacked, when they struck, how the previous patrols had tried and failed. The pattern became clear quickly. The patrols had always tried to meet the wyverns head-on, matching speed with speed and fire with fire. Exactly the kind of fight larger, stronger dragons were trained for. It had never worked because it played to the wyverns' strengths, not against them. Daniel suggested something different. Instead of chasing the wyverns in open sky, they would let the wyverns come to them, funneled into a narrow canyon near the village where their speed would count for nothing and their numbers would work against them instead. Nyra's precise, controlled flame, useless for open battle where raw heat mattered most, was perfect for lighting a series of small signal fires and igniting oil-soaked ropes strung low across the canyon at exactly the right moment. The plan worked almost exactly as Daniel had described it. The wyverns, chasing what looked like an easy, isolated target, followed Nyra into the canyon at dusk, and the trap closed around them before they understood what was happening. Nyra's flame, small and exact, lit the ropes in perfect sequence, and the resulting wall of fire and smoke scattered the raiders in confusion long enough for the village's own defenders to drive them off for good. When Nyra and Daniel returned to Skyhold 2 days later, word of the victory had already reached the court ahead of them, carried by villagers who had seen the whole thing with their own eyes. For the first time since her failed trial, Nyra walked into the stone hall not with her head lowered, but level, her wings held steady at her sides. Queen Vera looked at her for a long moment, then finally, slowly, nodded. The whispers in the hall that day were quieter than before, and for the first time, they did not all carry the same old mockery. Some of the younger hatchlings, the ones still waiting for their own naming trials, watched Naira with something closer to curiosity than scorn. A few of the servant dragons who had once shared her cold stone shelf now nodded to her as she passed, small gestures that meant more to Naira than any formal praise from the court ever could. Prince Rex watched too, though his expression carried none of that curiosity at all, only a cold, careful calculation that Naira was too tired and too relieved to notice that day. He said nothing in the hall itself, offering only a shallow, mocking bow when Vera dismissed the court, but the look he gave Daniel on his way out lingered far longer than any words would have. Not everyone in Skyhold celebrated the news from the eastern village. Prince Rex heard the story secondhand, from nobles eager to see his reaction, and something cold settled behind his eyes as he listened. He had spent his whole life being told he was the strongest hatchling Skyhold had produced in a generation, and now half the lower halls were whispering a different name, one that belonged to a runt he had mocked since the day she hatched. He did not confront Naira directly. That would have looked beneath him. Instead, he began speaking quietly to the older nobles who still remembered old wars with the Frostfawn clan, planting careful doubts. He suggested that no creature simply fell from the sky by accident, that perhaps this pale, wingless thing had been sent deliberately to weaken Skyhold from the inside by turning its own hatchlings against the old ways. He never said it directly to the queen. He did not need to. Rumors moved through Skyhold's halls faster than any messenger could fly, and within days, half the court was repeating a version of events far darker than what had actually happened. Daniel felt the change even without understanding every word spoken around him. Where servants had once looked at him with pure fear, some now looked at him with something closer to suspicion, as though waiting for him to reveal some hidden trick. Naira felt it too, sharper than he did, since she was the one who had to sit through court gatherings and hear the careful, poisoned questions asked in polite tones. It was during this uneasy stretch of days that Elder Thorn sought them out. Thorn was old even by dragon standards. His once bright scales faded to a dull bronze, one eye clouded white from age. He held no real power in Skyhold's court, but he kept something few others valued anymore: the kingdom's oldest histories, written on scrolls and carved into stone tablets few young dragons ever bothered to read. He found Naira and Daniel near the training yards one evening and asked, in a voice far gentler than his appearance suggested, if he might speak with them privately. Curious more than cautious, they agreed. In his quiet study, surrounded by cracked tablets and yellowed scrolls, Thorn told them a story that had mostly faded from Skyhold's memory. Long before Vera's grandmother ruled, long before the current border lines with Frostfawn were drawn, old records spoke of an alliance between dragons and a small folk from beyond the stars, creatures without wings or scales who had once fought alongside dragons against a common enemy. The records were incomplete, damaged by time, but Thorn believed they were not myth. He believed Daniel's arrival might be the first return of something Skyhold had simply forgotten, rather than something entirely new and dangerous. Daniel listened carefully as Naira translated what she could, piecing together enough to understand the shape of the story even where the details escaped him. He did not know if it was true. He had no memory of any old alliance, no proof beyond an old dragon's faded scrolls. But he understood, watching Thorn's careful, hopeful expression, that this story mattered to the old dragon for reasons beyond simple history. It was a reason to hope that change did not have to mean danger. Their quiet meeting was interrupted by urgent horns sounding across the mountain, sharp and repeating, a pattern Naira recognized immediately as a border alert. She and Daniel hurried to the outer walls alongside half the kingdom, where scouts were already reporting to General Drask in tense, clipped voices. The Frostfawn clan had been spotted moving in numbers along the northern border, far more than any routine patrol. Drask scouts believed it was more than posturing this time. Real war banners had been seen among their ranks. Word spread through Skyhold fast, and with it came a new wave of fear, the kind that made frightened people look for someone to blame. Rex used the moment well. Standing before the gathered court, he pointed out, loudly enough for the whole hall to hear, that Frostfang's sudden aggression had begun only after strange rumors of an outsider creature living within Skyhold's walls. He did not accuse Daniel outright. He did not need to. The suggestion alone was enough to turn frightened whispers into something closer to open suspicion. Queen Vera called for calm, but even she could not fully silence the fear spreading through her own court. Naira stood beside Daniel that night on the outer wall, watching distant torchlight flicker along the northern ridgeline where Frostfang forces were gathering, and understood, with a cold certainty, that whatever came next would decide far more than her own place in Skyhold. It would decide whether her kingdom could survive its own fear long enough to face a real enemy at all. Daniel said little that night, watching the same distant lights she watched, turning old memories of other battles, other wars, over in his mind. When he finally spoke, it was not to defend himself against the rumors, but to ask Naira a single quiet question, whether the walls below them had ever truly been tested by a real, coordinated attack. Her silence was answer enough, and it settled between them like the first cold warning of the storm still to come. Below them, in the lower halls, General Drask worked through the night with his officers, trying to plan for an attack Skyhold had not faced in generations. Most of his fighters had only ever trained against isolated raiders or single opponents, never against a disciplined force moving with real coordination. Drask knew this, even if he did not yet know what to do about it, and it left him with little patience left over for Rex's quiet accusations against the outsider. He had bigger problems than rumors, and some part of him, buried under decades of caution, had begun to wonder if the strange creature's outsider thinking might be worth more than the court's suspicion gave it credit for. The attack came on a night with no moon, exactly the kind of darkness the Frostfang clan had always preferred for their raids. It began with a false alarm far to the east, a small group of Frostfang scouts allowing themselves to be seen near an old watchtower, drawing Rex and Skyhold's strongest fighters away from the main gates before anyone realized the sighting was bait. By the time General Drask understood the trick, it was already too late to call the strike force back before nightfall. Skyhold's true defense, for the first hours of the coming battle, would rest on those left behind, the Wing Guard's younger and less experienced fighters, the servant caste, an old scholar, a gray hatchling once called useless, and a wingless creature from beyond the sky that half the court still did not fully trust. Daniel had spent the tense days since the border sighting preparing anyway, certain in his own mind that the Eastern Watchtower sighting felt wrong the moment he heard about it. He had used the time to study Skyhold's walls, its gates, its narrow mountain paths, sketching ideas in the dirt that most of the Wing Guard dismissed as strange outsider thinking. When the real attack began, striking the main gates just after midnight with a speed and coordination Skyhold had not faced in generations, it was those dismissed ideas that gave the defenders their only real chance. Frostfang warriors struck the gates in tight, disciplined groups, nothing like the wild individual charges Skyhold's fighters had always trained against. Drask, watching from the wall, realized within minutes that his fighters were being overwhelmed by tactics they had never been trained to face. It was Daniel, shouting through Naira's rushed translation, who suggested breaking Skyhold's usual formation entirely, spreading smaller mixed groups of servant and Wing Guard dragons along multiple points instead of concentrating everyone at the main gate, where Frostfang expected them. It was a strange plan, one that ignored generations of Skyhold tradition, and there was no time left to argue about it. Drask, out of options and fighters, gave the order. Naira found herself leading one of these small mixed groups along the eastern wall, a handful of servant dragons who had never been trained for real combat, standing beside her, waiting for instructions from a hatchling most of them had mocked only weeks earlier. She did not have time to think about that irony. Frostfang fighters were already scaling the eastern approach, faster and better coordinated than anything Skyhold's own patrols usually faced. Where a stronger dragon might have met them head-on, trading raw fire for fire, Naira used exactly the kind of precision Daniel had spent weeks teaching her. She directed her small, controlled flame not at the attackers themselves, but at the ropes and grappling lines they used to scale the cliffs, cutting their advance apart piece by piece instead of trying to overpower it directly. Her group followed her lead, striking narrow, exact targets instead of wasting strength on wild, sweeping attacks, and the eastern wall held far longer than Drask had expected it to. Elder Thorn, too old to fight directly, proved just as valuable in his own way, directing the movement of supplies and reinforcements from Skyhold's old tunnel network, paths so long forgotten that even Frostfang's scouts had missed them entirely. Daniel worked alongside him, using what he had learned of Skyhold's layout to redirect defenders exactly where the fighting grew worst, moment by moment, as the battle shifted across the mountain. The fighting stretched through the darkest hours of the night, brutal and close, with no clear victory in sight for either side. It was near dawn when Frostfang's forces made one final, concentrated push toward the main gates, that Nyra's group, exhausted and battered but still holding the eastern wall, became the key to the entire battle. Daniel realized, watching the enemy's movement from Thorn's tunnel maps, that Frostfang's final assault had left their own eastern flank dangerously thin, certain that the eastern wall would have already fallen. He sent word to Nyra through a runner, a desperate, half-formed plan built on exactly the kind of precise, controlled strike her flame was suited for. She led what remained of her exhausted group in a final push along the cliffs, striking directly at the exposed flank. Frostfang had never expected to face resistance from it all. The surprise was enough. Frostfang's disciplined formation broke apart in confusion, their coordinated assault collapsing into chaos exactly as the first light of dawn crossed the mountain. Rex and the returning strike force arrived just in time to see the enemy already retreating, driven back not by Skyhold's strongest fighters, but by those the kingdom had spent generations dismissing. General Drask found them there not long after, walking slowly along the shattered wall he had expected to lose hours earlier. He said little at first, simply studying the cut ropes, the scorch marks arranged in careful, deliberate lines instead of the wide, wasteful bursts he was used to seeing from young dragons in battle. He had commanded fighters for decades, and he recognized discipline when he saw it, even when it came from a source he had never expected. Rex landed nearby a short while later, his strike force finally returning from the false eastern sighting, and for a long moment he simply stared at the wall, at the exhausted defenders still standing along it, unwilling to believe what his own eyes were telling him. He said nothing, which was, in its own way, more telling than anything he could have said. Nyra stood at the edge of the shattered eastern wall as the sun rose fully over the mountains, wings scorched, claws bloodied, watching what remained of the Frostfang forces disappear back over the northern ridge. She did not feel like a hero. She felt only the deep, bone-tired relief of someone who had simply refused to fail when everything depended on her, and beside her, equally exhausted, stood the creature who had first taught her that being small did not mean being without a weapon of her own. The morning after the battle, Skyhold did not look like a kingdom that had won a war. Smoke still rose from broken sections of wall. The training yards were filled with wounded fighters instead of drilling nobles, and exhausted defenders sat wherever they could find space to rest, servant and noble caste alike, without any of the old lines that usually separated them. Queen Vera walked those broken yards herself that morning, something she rarely did, stopping to speak with fighters she would never have addressed personally before. When she reached the eastern wall, she found Nyra there, scorched and exhausted, sitting quietly beside Daniel among the servant dragons who had fought and bled alongside her through the night. Vera did not speak immediately. She looked out at the cliffs where the fiercest fighting had happened, at the cut ropes and broken grappling lines still scattered along the rock, evidence of exactly the kind of precise, controlled defense that had held the wall when raw strength alone had not been enough anywhere else. She had spent her whole reign believing Skyhold's strength came from its strongest fighters. Watching the aftermath of this battle, she understood, perhaps for the first time, how much of that strength had actually come from everyone else. Rex arrived shortly after, having returned too late from the false eastern sighting to take part in the battle that mattered most. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to explain, perhaps to shift blame elsewhere as he usually did, but something in his mother's expression stopped him before he found the words. For once, the court hall's loudest voice had nothing useful to say. 3 days later, Vera called the full court together, the same stone hall where Nyra had once failed her naming trial in front of everyone she knew. This time, the hall was quieter, subdued by loss and exhaustion rather than filled with easy laughter. Vera stood before the gathered dragons and spoke plainly, without the careful formality court gatherings usually demanded. She acknowledged that Skyhold's oldest traditions, the trials that decided a hatchling's worth before it had even learned to fly, had nearly cost the kingdom everything. She spoke of the servant caste dragons who had held the eastern wall, of an old scholar's forgotten tunnels, and of a gray hatchling once dismissed as useless who had led that defense with a precision none of Skyhold's strongest fighters had ever been trained to match. She spoke, too, of the outsider creature many had feared and suspected, who had spent his time in Skyhold not plotting against it, but studying it closely enough to help save it when it mattered most. Naira was called forward, and for the second time in that same hall, every eye in the room fixed on her. This time, there was no laughter. Vera announced that Naira would be given a formal place among Skyhold's advisors, not as a servant, not as a noble by old bloodline standards, but as something the kingdom had never officially recognized before, a voice earned through results rather than birth. Elder Thorn, standing nearby, looked prouder in that moment than Naira had ever seen him. Daniel was granted formal sanctuary within Skyhold, no longer a hidden secret kept in a cave, but a recognized guest of the crown, free to move through the kingdom openly for the first time since his crash. General Drask, never one for warm words, simply nodded to him once across the hall, which from Drask, Daniel had already learned, counted as high praise indeed. In the weeks that followed, Skyhold began slowly reworking the old naming trials, no longer judging hatchlings solely on the size of their flame or the strength of their wings. Elder Thorn was given the task of updating the kingdom's old records, adding a new chapter about the battle at the Eastern Wall, and about the strange, wingless creature whose old legend had finally returned. Not every change came easily. Some of the older nobles grumbled quietly about tradition being thrown aside too quickly, and Rex, though quieter than before, had not become a friend overnight. He still watched Naira with something guarded in his eyes, though it was no longer simple scorn. Vera made it clear to her son, in private words that only the two of them heard, that Skyhold's future would not be built on strength alone anymore, whether he liked it or not. Rex did not argue. For the first time in his life, he had watched a battle won without him, and it had left him with more to think about than he was used to. Word of the Eastern Wall spread beyond Skyhold's borders as well. Other dragon kingdoms, hearing how a servant caste hatchling and an outsider had turned back a Frostfang assault, began sending quiet messages asking questions Skyhold had never been asked before. What was this creature that had fallen from the sky? Was the old alliance Elder Thorn spoke of truly returning? Vera answered carefully, unwilling to promise more than she understood herself, but she no longer dismissed the old scrolls as forgotten history. She had Thorn bring them to every council meeting from then on. Daniel, for his part, began helping repair the damaged sections of wall using the same kind of thinking that had helped defend them, teaching interested dragons simple methods of building that had never occurred to Skyhold's stonework before. He still did not know if he would ever find a way home, or if any of his old crew had survived the crash that scattered them. But standing among a kingdom slowly rebuilding itself, stronger in ways it had not been before the attack, he found it easier than expected to imagine a life here, at least for now. On a quiet evening not long after, Naira and Daniel returned to the western cliffs where they had first met, the wreckage long since cleared away, the trees slowly growing back around the scorched earth. Naira's scales still carried the same dull gray color they always had, but no one in Skyhold called her useless anymore. She sat beside Daniel as the sun set over the mountains, watching a kingdom that had spent generations valuing only raw strength slowly learning to see worth in every shape it came in, and understood that whatever challenges still waited ahead, Skyhold would never again be the kingdom it once was.